Today is March 27th, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing military conflict in Ukraine. I want to start, as I usually do, by taking a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map. Keep that in mind when we look at what is happening along the line of contact. We need to keep an eye on this area, Zaporozhye. This is one of the areas where Ukraine has claimed it wants to launch its offensive, and they seek to reach the coast and cut Crimea off from the rest of Russia. Unfortunately, for that plan, there's the Crimean Bridge. There's also a major port here that Russia was using to supply Crimea before the bridge was completed. There are also ports and airports all across the peninsula that can be used to move people and goods of all kinds, including in support of a military operation. People have to remember that Russia has been maintaining a very significant military operation in Syria using just their ships and their strategic airlift. So keep that in mind in regards to Crimea, which is much closer than Syria. Again, a lot of the most important fighting is taking place not only in Bakhmut, but now also Avdeevka. This city outside of Donetsk city, this is one of the areas where Ukraine has been shelling the civilian population of Donetsk city for the last 8 to 9 years. And as you can see, they face complete encirclement. And you see these red rifle icons. This indicates fighting, maybe not a change in territory, but Russian soldiers, Russian units fighting in these areas. It is getting quite serious for Ukraine. And we see incidents like this reported by this pro-Ukrainian live map. Russian aviation conducted 4 airstrikes in Avdeevka this morning. That's very significant. And there have been bombings across Ukraine. I want to point your attention to this article here. Russia uses its own kind of smart bombs in Sumy Oblast. So this is, let's go to the map and look to see where Sumy is. It's all the way in the northeast, past Kharkov in this region. We also have articles like this that talk about, this is ABC News, the use of gliding bombs to attack several regions, and this is according to the Ukrainian military. So going back to the map, that is the situation in Avdeevka, and that is the situation in several other areas of Ukraine. This is very important because Russia being able to use its military aviation more freely over Ukraine is going to significantly tilt everything in favor of Russia, and will accelerate things significantly. A lot of what we see, this slow incremental approach by Russia, it is because it takes a long time to use their artillery and their rockets and their missile forces to weaken Ukrainian defenses and move in and take those defenses. It takes a very long time to do that if you're trying to conserve trained manpower and military equipment while eliminating large amounts of enemy manpower and equipment. That is what they've been doing. But the use of military aviation will accelerate this significantly because they can drop more munitions, which are more destructive in many more places than artillery, rockets, and missiles can reach, or cause more damage than artillery, rockets, and missiles can cause. The reason that Russia hasn't been using its military aviation is ironically because Ukraine had a large amount of Soviet-era air defense systems at their disposal, an integrated air defense system that severely limited what Russia was able to do, and they had to depend on drones and cruise missiles to do damage across the majority of Ukraine. Now, a lot of people have often asked me, why doesn't Russia interdict Western military supplies coming over the border from Poland? Why don't they interdict it there? If they could use their military aviation, they could. That's what they did in Syria, to interdict supplies going to ISIS and Al-Qaeda from NATO territory. They could do that in Ukraine if they're able to degrade Ukrainian air defense systems enough. And this tells me the beginnings of Russia using its military aviation in this way tells me that Ukrainian air defense systems are being significantly degraded, and there are huge gaps now in coverage, which is allowing Russia to do this. And Avdeevka is one of these places where they have repeatedly carried out these kinds of strikes. Let's look at Bakhmut. This is the other major fortified city that faces encirclement by Russian forces. Again, you can see the red rifle icons inside the city. Russian forces hold the eastern half of the city, divided by this waterway here, and now they're moving into the north and the south of the remainder of Bakhmut. And of course, we see heavy fighting in what looks like these salients, not only encircling Bakhmut, but extending toward Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And we also see salients here reaching out towards Seversk, which is the last fortified city in this defense line that runs from Seversk through Bakhmut down to Avdeevka. Now, one thing I want to point out is speculation over Ukraine's upcoming offensive. We've talked a lot about Ukraine pushing toward the coast in Zaporozhye and Kherson, cutting the land bridge for Crimea. There's a lot of forces that are supposedly staging in the Donbas region outside of Bakhmut. There's speculation that that could be a counteroffensive to break the encirclement of Bakhmut. But it is also possible that this is just one of the areas where they are going to launch their main offensive that they have been preparing for. If we remember their fall offensive last year, that was aimed at Kharkov and also Kherson. They may attempt two or more separate offensives here. But something I want to point out, again, this New York Times article, Defenses Carved into the Earth, the link will be in the video description below, December 2022. And they talk about these extensive fortifications, layered fortifications that Russia has created. And if you scroll down, you'll notice that they're not only in the Kherson and Zaporozhye area, protecting Crimea, they're also in the Donbas region. So Russian forces have made extensive preparations months ago for a possible Ukrainian offensive, either in the south or in the east. They have really covered their bases. They've mobilized 350,000 reservists, at least 350,000, and we have not seen them committed, the bulk of those reservists committed anywhere along the line of contact yet. So what I expect Russia to do is to just wait for the offensive, weather it, and after they destroy essentially an army's worth of men and equipment, they will have all of these forces at their disposal to take the next step, whatever that may be. The inevitably severe losses that Ukraine suffers, no matter how successful or unsuccessful their offensive is, unless they can deal a devastating blow to the entire Russian military and the entire Russian state, unless they can do that, at the end of their offensive, their forces will be depleted. They will have lost all of their trained manpower, their tanks will be gone, their artillery will be gone, and they will be left waiting for the West to replace all of their losses, just like after their fall offensive in Kharkov and Kherson last year. Only the West really, admittedly, doesn't have anything left. So I want to talk again about Russian military industrial output versus what the West has sent Ukraine and what they could feasibly send Ukraine in the future. And let's just talk about tanks. So this is an article from CNN. It's from January 2023. West to deliver 321 tanks to Ukraine, says diplomat. And then they talk about North Korea also. The article says Western countries will deliver more than 300 tanks to Ukraine, Kiev's ambassador to France said. As of today, numerous countries have officially confirmed their agreement to deliver 321 heavy tanks to Ukraine. The figure comes after the US this week pledged to provide 31 M1 Abrams tanks, and Germany agreed to send 14 Leopard 2A6s. Previously, the United Kingdom has pledged 14 Challenger 2 tanks, while Poland has asked for approval from Germany to transfer some of its own German-made Leopard 2s to Ukraine. And now there's this other article from Statista. Number of disclosed main battle tanks committed to Ukraine between January 24th and January 15th, 2023 by type and donor country. And if you look, you can see that there's actually a very small number of Western main battle tanks compared to T-72s and their variants from Poland, the Czech Republic. As a matter of fact, it's nearly 800 tanks in total. Some of these are antiquated T-55s, older T-72s, which you might get away using as a main battle tank. The T-55 could be useful as an assault gun or for defensive positions, but as a main battle tank, most certainly not. And the same goes for the Leopard 1s that are being sent. There's quite a number of these Leopard 1s that are being sent. So all in all, about 800 tanks, a mixture of antiquated Leopard 1s, T-55s, and T-72s, some newer modernized T-72s, and a number of Western main battle tanks, M1 Abrams, which actually, even though they're trying to speed up the delivery of these M1 Abrams, in reality, it'll be months before that is ready. So this is not 800 tanks right now in Ukraine ready to go. This is going to be spread out over the next year. What about Russia? If we recognize this as a war of attrition, and we can see that Russia is fighting a war of attrition, they're not necessarily interested in taking territory, large amounts of territory. They are attempting to demilitarize Ukraine, eliminate its military. That is the priority. Everything else is secondary. And when you're doing that, that means you're waging a war of attrition. What about Russia? How many tanks, how many new tanks do they have coming? So we have this from Associated Press. Russia's security chief blasts West, dangles nuclear threats. The headline aside, there's something interesting that was mentioned in this article. It says Medvedev, who heads the Security Council panel coordinating weapons production, derided Western statements alleging that Russia is running out of weapons and charged the Russian weapons industries have increased output. He said that Russia will produce 1,500 battle tanks this year alone and boost production of other weapons to meet the army's needs. His claims couldn't be independently verified, but 1,500 tanks. And I'm going to assume he means brand new tanks in addition to modernized tanks. When I say modernized tanks, the T-72B3M is essentially a new tank. They replace the gun, the engine, the fire control system, they add on armor. Virtually every important component is replaced, and it is brought up to the standard of a T-90M, which is the most recent, newest main battle tank that Russia has in numbers on the battlefields. The T-14 isn't quite there yet. I pointed this article out many times. So they're saying 1,500. A lot of, the Associated Press is acting as if that's probably not true. That's what they mean when they say his claims couldn't be independently verified, as if he's making it up. We have this article from November last year, Novoya Gazeta. This is extremely anti-Russian media funded by the US government. The title of the article is "The Barren Barrels." And they're trying to make an argument that Russia cannot keep up in a war of attrition with the West. And the article says, our source working for one of the state corporations in Russia estimates that the current Uralvagonzavod's production capacity to be at 200 to 250 tanks a year. That's new tanks. And it also says that Russia is capable of modernizing up to 600 additional tanks, which gives you a total of 850 tanks. And these are going to be tanks that are of a type that Russian tank crews are familiar with, have years of experience operating. Maintenance crews have years and years of experience maintaining them, and a logistics network that has been built up over the course of the Russian Federation's entire history to sustain these tanks on the battlefield. This is in stark contrast to Ukraine's situation, where they're receiving not just a type of tank they have no experience operating, but a multitude of tanks that they have no experience operating. These tanks are entirely different from each other. They have different ammunition and fuel requirements and maintenance requirements, training requirements. They're basically creating a multitude of tank forces to operate these tanks on the battlefield with the associated logistics and sustainment networks that need to be created for each different type of tank. Logistics nightmare in the middle of, again, a war of attrition. So if Novoya Gazeta's numbers, most likely taken from right at the beginning of the special military operation, if they're saying that Russia was making around 850 modern tanks, a combination of brand new tanks and modernized tanks brought up to the same standards as brand new tanks. If they're saying 850 tanks were being built then, over the course of a year, an obvious motivation to expand production, is it hard to believe that they've boosted this to 1,500 tanks? And Uralvagon Zavod is not the only tank factory in Russia. They have other tank factories. They have other types of tanks like the T-80 that are made and modernized elsewhere. I think 1,500 is actually a reasonable number if you're talking about modernized tanks also. But let's just say it's only 850. That's still more tanks than the West is able to scrape together and send Ukraine. And again, it really does matter that we're talking about 850 tanks. Russian tank crews are familiar with, the mechanics are familiar with, the logistics networks are already created to support on the battlefield, versus 800 tanks of all different kinds that Ukraine is going to have to create the logistics, sustainment, and maintenance networks to support on the battlefield. We're also hearing about Russia bringing in older tanks. We heard a lot about the T-62, and I talked about how the T-62 would be great for use as an assault gun. And an assault gun is different than a tank in that it works with infantry. When the infantry need a big gun pointed in some direction, they will call on an assault gun. It'll roll in and it'll point its gun at where the infantry say, and it'll fire. That's different than a tank. A tank focuses on speed and mobility, armor, protection, and firepower. It's meant to move very quickly across the battlefield as an offensive weapon. So there are two different roles. What makes it a tank is how it is being used, and these T-62s are almost certainly being used either as assault guns or for defensive positions to augment the firepower of the battalion tactical group. I'll get into that in just a moment. Now we hear about Russia taking T-55 tanks out of storage and using them. And I just want to show you the disparity in the coverage. This is going to be two articles from Forbes written by the exact same author, David Axe. And I just want to show you the two completely different ways he covers Ukraine getting T-55s and Russia getting T-55. So when Ukraine was given T-55 tanks, this is how David Axe at Forbes covered it. Super upgraded M55S tanks have arrived in Ukraine. It's all about how awesome the T-55S is and how it's going to make such a big difference, and it's really game changing for Ukraine. And then when rumors started going around about Russia rolling out T-55s, this is how he covered it. Russia's ancient T-55 tanks could double as artillery, but not very good artillery. And the problem with his article, when you go through it, is that he leaves no possibility at all that these tanks could have been modernized. The T-55 has been around for a very long time. It was the most produced tank in history. Something like 100,000 of them have been built, and all throughout history they have been used, upgraded, modified, and used all over. They're still being used, say, on the battlefield in Syria, for example. And Russia has modernized a large number of them over the years. And they get things like gun stabilization, laser range finders, ballistic computers. So all of the things you need to do to improve accuracy. Russia, most certainly, if they are taking T-55s out of storage and putting them on the battlefield, they're not bringing in a base model from 1950. They most certainly will have been upgraded over time, and that is what they're going to be using. Now, what are they going to be using the T-55 for? An assault gun? Possibly. It would be a great assault gun. All you need for an assault gun is for it to be armored. A T-55 or T-62 has plenty of armor against small arms fire if you're going up against infantry. And it needs to have a gun that's more powerful than anything the infantry would be able to carry around with them. And of course, mobility. And the T-55 and T-62 are perfectly suited to follow infantry on the battlefield. What else could it be used for? David Axe is talking about artillery. The gun on the T-55 actually has a very long range, I think something like 16 kilometers, which is much further than the main gun on, say, a T-90, which will hit targets up to 4 kilometers. Let me explain to you again how Ukraine has attempted in previous offensives to break through Russian defense lines, and how they most certainly will be trying to break through Russian defense lines again. When you understand how Ukraine is trying to break through Russian defenses and the whole process, you will understand why bringing in T-55s or welding naval guns on the top of MTLB armored vehicles, why, as ridiculous as it might seem, this additional firepower could actually make a huge difference trying to break a Ukrainian offensive. We have to go back to Kherson, because the fighting around Kherson, the Kherson offensive, is most likely going to be very similar to what Ukraine attempts again, wherever it is that they launch their offensive. And I want to point out that despite the fact that eventually Russia withdrew from Kherson city to the other side of the Dnieper River, that was more to consolidate their forces. The Kherson city, holding that, was almost a separate war from everything else going on. They wanted to consolidate their forces, and this was a side project, essentially, a distraction from what Russia was attempting to do. But before they did that, they had been out fighting Ukrainian forces the entire time. There were no Ukrainian breakthroughs. They were being outfought by the Russian forces the entire time. And if Russia wanted to and continued investing in the defense of Kherson city, they probably could have held it. They felt there were more important things for their resources to be used on, and they wanted to reduce the risk of those troops being cut off entirely. So it was one less thing to worry about. Let's look at this Washington Post article from September 2022. Wounded Ukrainian soldiers reveal steep toll of Kherson's offensive. And I'm going to read to you from this Washington Post article, and I'm going to explain to you what went on there according to the Western media. And I want you to imagine the same thing, but on a larger scale, happening during this upcoming Ukrainian offensive, again, wherever they decide to launch it. It says, in a dimly lit hospital room in southern Ukraine, soldiers with severed limbs, shrapnel wounds, mangled hands, and shattered joints recounted the lopsided disadvantages their units faced in the early days of a new offensive to expel Russian forces from the strategic city of Kherson. The soldiers said they lacked the artillery needed to dislodge Russia's entrenched forces, and described a yawning technology gap with their better equipped adversaries. They're calling Kherson city strategic. But even after Russia gave it up, Ukrainian forces weren't ever able to move in and administer it because it's still in range of all of Russia's long-range firepower on the other side of the Dnieper River. And it gave Ukraine no advantage whatsoever. It's not as if there's any possibility of them crossing the Dnieper River there at Kherson. Holding Kherson gives them absolutely no advantage whatsoever over Russia since Russia withdrew from it. I just want to point out that that's what the Western media does. Any city that Ukraine may possibly get a hold of is always strategic, and any city that Ukraine is about to lose is of little strategic value, like Bakhmut and soon Avdeevka. Washington Post continues. It says, Russia's Orlan drones exposed Ukrainian positions from more than a kilometer above their heads. They said an altitude that meant they never heard the buzz of the aircraft tracking their movements. Russian tanks emerged from newly built cement fortifications to blast infantry with large caliber artillery, the wounded Ukrainian soldiers said. The vehicles would then shrink back beneath the concrete shelters, shielded from mortar and rocket fire. Counter-battery radar systems automatically detected and located Ukrainians who were targeting the Russians with projectiles, unleashing a barrage of artillery fire in response. Russian hacking tools hijacked the drones of Ukrainian operators who saw their aircraft drift away helplessly. Does that sound like Ukraine was out fighting Russia and would eventually break through? The answer is no, it didn't. And that is exactly what's going to happen with the upcoming Ukrainian offensive. Now, let me explain to you what Ukraine is going to try to do. And it's not as if there's no possible chance of them breaking through. There is, but it all depends on them being able to overwhelm the firepower of Russian forces on the defensive. Ukraine lacks long-range firepower, both in the variety and quantity that Russia has. So they'll never be able to do this incremental, careful, conservative advance across the battlefield the way Russia does. They have no ability to do that. Their only chance of launching a successful offensive against Russia is to accumulate a huge number of troops and combat vehicles and rush at the same time across a wide section of the line of contact and hope that they can oversaturate Russian firepower, their ability to target and destroy Ukrainian units before they come in range of Russian positions and begin inflicting casualties on Russian forces. And those casualties have to be large enough to compel the commanders of these battalion tactical groups, which are between 600 and 800 men strong, and they have a huge amount of firepower. MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems, self-propelled artillery guns, main battle tanks, anti-tank guided missiles, a whole range of very heavy firepower, all in a unit the size of a battalion. These battalions are obviously going to work together with each other, and they're also going to expand their own size with additional units that are needed. And they're also going to include other types of units around Kherson. They not only had battalion tactical groups, they also had airborne units helping in the defense. Now, this strategy of rushing toward the defensive positions of the battalion tactical groups, this was all laid out in this paper, Defeating the Russian Battalion Tactical Group. I'll include the link to this in the video description below. And essentially what U.S. Army Captain Nicholas Fiore was saying was exactly that. You need a large amount of troops to move very quickly in a dispersed manner toward the battalion tactical group, preventing the battalion tactical group from eliminating all advancing units before they are in range and can inflict casualties on the battalion tactical group. And if they can do this successfully, they can compel the battalion tactical group commander to withdraw rather than suffer heavy losses and become ineffective on the battlefield, or even potentially be encircled and captured. As Ukrainian troops are moving across the battlefield, of course, entire platoons are going to be wiped out. Ukraine lost entire brigades worth of men and machines around Kherson. They'll be wiped out, but a number of Ukrainian platoons will actually get in range and be able to inflict casualties on Russian forces. Now, bringing in these T-55s and even these MTLBs with naval guns welded to the top, this is going to bring in additional firepower. That last gap where Ukraine is finally coming within range of Russian forces, these are all just extra guns, additional firepower to completely saturate that zone with gunfire, tank shells, 25 millimeter naval gun rounds. It's basically a 25 millimeter machine gun. They're doing that specifically because Ukraine is using this tactic to exploit a weakness of the battalion tactical group, and by bringing in additional firepower, they are filling the gap and eliminating that weakness. The Western media acts as if they're bringing in these T-55s, T-62s, these old naval guns welded on these armored vehicles because they're running out of tanks and other modern weaponry, which simply isn't true. Even the Voya Gazeta admits that Russia is producing more tanks than the US and Europe combined. And that's not even accounting the last year where they almost certainly began expanding production. Now let's talk about something else utterly essential. I wanted to get back to this Jamestown Foundation article about Russian shell production. Alexander Mercouris, in one of his recent videos, talked about the methodology used by the Jamestown Foundation. He talked about how the data points picked by the author really were not a good way to go about this. If you really want to try to figure out how much of any particular armament Russia is producing, you need to know all kinds of things. You need to know how big these factories are. You need to look at satellite images of the factories, calculate floor space, look at the parking lot, the number of employees, get publicly available information about other products being made by these factories, and really try to break down the physical space and the minimum and maximum amount of any particular product that they would be able to produce. And when you look at things like artillery shell prices back in 2005 and you use that as a data point, and you do not look at it in the right context. In 2005, Russia's economy was still suffering immensely, and prices would have been skewed. And they were making far fewer shells then than they are now. And as time goes by, you make more of something, inevitably the price of each individual item, the price will go down. None of this seems to be taken into account by the Jamestown Foundation in this article, which means looking at these numbers, they are almost certainly higher. And I want to show you the numbers here. The United States, when the special military operation began, was producing about 15,000 shells a month, which equals to about 180 shells a year. So that was in 2022. Look at 2015. In 2015, even with this poor methodology, the Jamestown Foundation article is indicating that in 2015, Russia was already making more artillery shells per year than the United States. And then the US increased production to around 22,000 shells per month. By 2016, Russia was already producing more than that. As you can see, even with this poor methodology, the numbers indicate that Russia is making more shells than the United States. And you can see that each year, the number of shells produced was increasing, and the amount that they increased by was also increasing. And if the numbers of shells are almost certainly higher, we're talking millions of shells being produced by Russia by 2022. And if production is still expanding by this year and next year, it should be even higher still. And I talk about tank production and the way Russia is using its tanks, especially its older tanks. And I talk about shell production because when Ukraine launches this offensive, they are going to suffer immense losses. No matter how successful their offensive might be, if they push all the way to the coast and they cut the land bridge to Crimea, the question then becomes what comes next? because the West is unable to resupply them and replace all of those losses, while Russia will be able to. And not only that, as we've watched Russia do in Kharkov and also Kherson, if there is a instance where they feel they are going to suffer heavy casualties, or their units appear even the most remote possibility of being encircled, they will withdraw. Because it's not about holding territory, it's about demilitarizing Ukraine. It's about bringing them to this point now where the Western media itself is saying this is Ukraine's last chance, because the West has nothing else to send them once this offensive is over. It is a war of attrition. It's not being broken down into different phases. It is a single war of attrition with an accumulative effect that is adding up every single day. And after the offensive, that will actually be Ukraine playing into Russia's strategy, giving up all of this equipment, all of this trained manpower by taking it out from behind defensive positions that Russia would have had to fight hard to get to, putting it on the battlefield there for the battalion tactical groups, and now augmented with all of this additional firepower to wipe them out, essentially. That's what we're looking at ahead of these offensives. I think nobody should make the mistake of underestimating Ukraine. I have no doubt that they are going to be throwing absolutely everything they have at Russian defense lines, either in Zaporozhye or maybe somewhere in the east. They may succeed in taking not just a little bit of territory, but a significant amount of territory. But at the end of the offensive, the problem still remains. If this is a war of attrition, you've taken this territory, you've expended all this manpower and equipment, how are you going to replace it? How are you going to sustain your military operations from that point onward? That is the question. So we'll keep a real close eye on this, what's happening on the battlefield, but also this bigger picture of military industrial output